Good morning. Time now 8 a.m. Actually, a minute past 8 a.m. on Friday, July 19th, in 2024 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar Series. In fact, this is a special edition as we are dedicating some of those seminars to particularly focusing on the Africa-related publications and initiatives. Today is one of them. We are going to feature today a new report put together by our Africa team titled Land Policies for Resilient and Equitable Growth in Africa. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Koicho Mori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. So next, the 30-40 minutes, we are going to listen to Klaus Denninger, who is one of the co-lead authors of this new report on land policies. Klaus is lead economist from the World Bank's DEC Development Economic Vice Presidency, which is a World Bank's research arm. Just before starting this seminar, we are having an informal chat with Klaus. It seems Klaus has been deeper connection with some of you Japanese academics focusing on Africa, land policies, etc. So after Klaus' presentation on this new report on the land policies, I'll read a question that we received from some of you in advance. But if you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please send your questions by using the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply send your question directly to me by email, or you can post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. So I'll read your question on your behalf, asking Klaus to make comment on your questions. So I would like to now invite Klaus to come in and start the presentation on the new report, Land Policies for Resilient and Equitable Growth in Africa, which was released on April 22 this year. Klaus, please come in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to make that presentation. I think you can see my screen, correct? So I think this is about the report, as Koichi already mentioned, on land policies for resilient and equitable growth in Africa. I want to make 4 points. First, to highlight why land rights are important. Then to talk a little bit how Africa measures up. What are the new opportunities for Africa, and what does that mean in terms of potential next steps? I think the importance of land rights there has been a lot of research, including by Japanese researchers, as mentioned by Koichi-san, that have highlighted that land has an important function as a safety net for food security, but also for empowering landholders, especially women, so that they can take greater risk and invest in physical and human capital if their rights are secure. There is a lot of evidence, especially in Ethiopia, but all over in other African countries as well, that documented land rights allow to enforce women's rights, increase social empowerment by women, and have very positive impact on human capital investment down the road. Also, they can be very easily realized because there are a couple of examples, including from Rwanda and from Lesotho, that by just making joint titling the default or joint documented ownership the default, you can actually increase women co-ownership from anywhere 10 to 20 to 60 to 80%. So that really has a very important impact. And of course, it's not only relevant in developing countries, but also in the developing world, because everywhere globally, land and real estate make up about 40 to 60% of assets that people own. A second important benefit is that if people have secure rights to land, they don't need to spend resources fighting over this land, but instead can use these resources to invest. And that so they don't need to build fences and trees or stay on the land to guard it, but they can actually invest in long-term resource management, to enhance soil fertility and sustainable resource management, which is very important, especially as the alternative in many contexts is deforestation and potentially irreversible resource degradation. Again, there's lots of studies that have shown that, and of course, if protection and the need to stay on the land is mostly done by women or by children, that has also a very important gender aspect. A third important aspect is that secure rights facilitate long-term transactions to bring land to better use, increase productivity and welfare, and allow temporary transfers in response to shocks. If somebody gets sick, they can lease it out to their neighbor. And also, I think, as the economy diversifies, facilitate short-term migration. That brings us to the second point, the individual benefits from documented rights in land. That means formally documented, not only secured at the local level, that facilitate, which normally is through registries, that facilitates contracting with unrelated parties as in the context of structural change for farm size to expand and diversification of employment opportunities. Also then related to attract skills and capital to rural areas and access markets that have not been available locally. And of course, I think in that context, it is important to regulate that regulation is in place to avoid market power, because land is an immobile asset. And of course, this immobility has long been shown to make an ideal collateral for financial markets, because it is that can reduce credit rationing. And that use of land as collateral, of course, is conditional on a liquid land market, on the ability to foreclose, and the protection of third-party rights, which has not often always been the case. And that's why many efforts to increase credit access through land titling have actually faltered. But there is now increasing evidence that if you put all of these elements together, which of course is more likely in urban than in rural context, then land can actually be used for credit access. And I will have some examples later on, and foster entrepreneurship and risk-taking even in developed markets. And of course, that is very important for deepening financial markets much more broadly. Also, land markets aggregate available information and provide price signals that improves both the functioning of markets, because the studies have shown that having prices publicly available reduces price dispersion and competitiveness in land markets, both rural and urban. It also allows, especially in the context of climate change that often affects land values and the potential for land use, that the opportunity cost for both private and public investment can be assessed in advance, so that the most productive and most rewarding investments can be chosen. And of course, it is very important also for insurance and the incentives to objectively assess risk associated with specific locations, so that and provide the price signals for people not to build, for example, in flood-prone areas that may create a lot of problems down the road. Also, public benefit, I think while a lot of the literature has focused on private benefits, of course, public benefits from documented rights to land are equally important. Because public land accounts for 30 to 50% of land anywhere in the world, and it is a key endowment for local government to provide local services, but often it fails to produce public goods and instead is ill-managed and squandered, which is a big loss for society overall, and of course also makes it very difficult to acquire land and to use public land, especially if land prices and land rights are not clear. These pictures here on the right side are from 4 African cities. The dark lines are the infrastructure that was in place at independence, and the other lines are roads that have been constructed since then, and that shows very clearly that planning and rights and expansion in a way that urban infrastructure is very durable, and you want to make sure that you plan urban expansion properly, which is only possible if public land is managed properly and governments can acquire land for infrastructure construction. Second, and closely related, is the regulation of externalities, which is important, especially in urban areas where building standards and zoning are needed to prevent negative externalities from land use and to also provide public goods and amenities that can significantly increase land values. And of course, the third element is related to property taxation at the local level. That has been shown by many studies to provide the basis for a social contract and accountability of government to taxpayers, because to provide public goods and amenities that are in turn capitalized into land values. I think sewers and also electricity are a great example. Then, of course, the fact that these taxes are local provides the basis for subnational competition to attract skills across cities. And I think it can even be used then to finance infrastructure by local governments through issuing municipal bonds. And that, of course, is a very important element that is needed for financial markets and such investments. What is needed to realize these benefits? I think there are three elements. The first is to have registers and cadasters in place to publicly document rights. And of course, I think registers are essentially defining the subject, whereas cadasters, which are the associated maps, define the objects to which these rights are defined. What is very important, and I think has often been a problem, is that resources are available and services are delivered at effectively, so that maintenance is ensured, so that you don't title land and then people reverse to informality. And of course, I think these institutions have been developed. This is an example for a register. This is the example for the cadastre. Historically from developed countries, and of course it took very long time in developed countries to develop these institutions. Developing countries need to do so much faster and with much less margin of errors. That's why it is very important to have clear policies and guidance in that respect. The second element is transparent regulation of land use. We have already seen that in the context of land use planning and taxation. And the third one is to have enforcement that is effective, accessible, and impartial. That relates both to contracts between private parties. I think the most important one is default on mortgage obligations, and to administrative means in terms of local land use regulations. And of course, in that context, it is often important to note that such enforcement in many developing countries is less than impartial, and land is often being used as a source of political or economic power. How does Africa measure up in terms of land institutions? I think the news there is not that positive, because formal institutions often have very limited outreach. Household surveys show that coverage with title is universally low, even for urban residential land. If you see the figures here that are for some of the countries where such data is available, even the most, I think it ranges between about 30% and about 5% of title in residential urban areas in Senegal and Chad. Most of these titles are male dominated. More than 70 to 88% in Mali are only in the name of men, without women having any documented rights. And of course, they're often very wealth biased. Individuals in the fourth quartile of the expenditure distribution have 50% or more of the titles in most of the countries, which again, I think is contrary to the universal access and the need for the poor people also to be able to make investments in their land. If we look at agricultural or rural land, the news is even worse. I think in most African countries for which this data is available, the maximum is 7% of title land in Côte d'Ivoire, and so it is less than 10% everywhere. And of course, what is interesting is that looking at the risk of dispossession, there is no relation between having title and the risk of dispossession, which means that also people have very little trust, which is something we will come to later. I think what is important is that often progress and broader coverage is impeded by inefficient service delivery, high registration costs, which are the reason source for this wealth bias, a very reliance on paper records rather than digital delivery, which both reduces the quality and increases the cost of service delivery. And of course, timely regulations for court decisions are then also very difficult. This is illustrated in this table. The registration cost is between 9 and 7% everywhere, with the exception of North Africa, compared to Eastern and Central Europe, where it's 2.7%. I think very few countries have digital records that are linked the cadastre and the registry, even in the main city. And of course, that makes planning very, very difficult, and planning and linking to satellite imagery very difficult, especially in Southern Africa. So I think that all creates a lot of means that the service delivery is very poor. On the other hand, also, and that means that formal institutions often command very little trust, which is then too low to support impersonal markets. In only about less than 20% of the population, this is from Afrobarometer survey, less than 20% indicate that they are confident that if they go to the land registry, they can get reliable land info, and 61% think that rich people are able to fraudulently, through bribes, actually acquire land title to land that doesn't belong to them. And of course, that means that there's really a big governance issue. On the other hand, traditional leaders still play a very important role, especially in local dispute resolution. This is illustrated here, that in more than 50% or in about 50% across Africa, local leaders play a role in dispute resolution, less so in land allocation or governance. And many people think, more than 50% think, that their role should increase overall, or that they should have more influence. However, traditional institutions, of course, can fill this gap if the regulation is clear and if they have a role that links to the formal system, but they have limitations because they're normally geographically and ethnically contained. That a lot of African countries have legislation in place to recognize them, but often this regulation is not operational and therefore cannot be made effective. And of course, without such clarification, you may actually get worse outcomes by having traditional leaders and modern institutions compete rather than collaborate. And that, I think, is what we are seeing in many cases, where uncertainty increases because landowners and users are not sure who is in charge. They may go to the traditional authority or to the modern court, depending on where they think they have better chances of succeeding. And of course, that is a reason for conflict that we see with very bad impacts in many African countries. One issue that is very important is that climate change can significantly exacerbate this, because higher temperature and shocks will reduce agricultural potential I think that is the universal opinion among all of the studies. I have the predictions from one of the studies here in this graph. And we see that already in our recent studies show that already higher temperatures force landholders and cultivators to increase defensive expenditures on pest protection, for example, because pests are becoming more damaging with higher temperatures. Actually, in a broader sense, it increases the risk and the vulnerability if insurance is not there. and it also creates the danger macroeconomically of African isolated regions actually being caught in a subsistence trap, where the need to provide for their subsistence causes them to specialize in agriculture, even though they don't have a comparative advantage in agriculture, and productivity declines in the long term, and they will be subject to more and more risk of shocks, especially if they expand into marginal areas, which has been the pattern in Africa in the recent decades. And a number of studies show that even though adaptation investment can increase risk coping, if that adaptation investment is not accompanied by local empowerment and secure land rights, then of course it may actually increase conflicts. And that, I think, has been the case and has been shown by studies, for example, for transhumans, that is very important and widespread in the Sahel, where localized conflicts have actually increased overall violence and jihadist conflicts. Some of the aggregate figures here show that a dramatic increase in land-related violent events in West Africa, especially in West Africa, from about 3% of all conflicts to about 10%. And that, of course, if that is a very concerning pattern overall. And that means that clear rights, which may include secondary rights for pastoralists and herders, where migration routes and watering holes need to be secured, need to be an important focus for policy. And that can then also foster intensification and provide the basis for renewables or investment in biodiversity and payments for environmental services, which, unless the rights are secured, may also increase conflict and not have a positive impact. How can Africa capitalize on new opportunities? I think there is very positive news in that digital tools can really improve the security and the use of rights, and do so in a way that is much more cost effective than in the past. I think there are four elements that can do that, and I think this, for example, is a crop map that was digitized, that was generated only based on satellite imagery, and that illustrates what is possible. I think on the one hand, digital technology can reduce the cost of right recognition and increase the transparency by streamlining workflow and reducing the cost of service delivery. Second, remote sensing can link land rights to land use. It can allow to monitor land use in real time, enforce land use regulation through satellite monitoring, and it can also then provide the basis for private contracts and supply chain certification. I think there are a lot of examples outside of Africa, but also this is coming in terms of cocoa and export crops also through the private sector initiatives in Africa. Third is that interoperability can increase record publicity and quality, which is very important, especially in urban contexts. And of course, connectivity can help to improve participation and decentralization, because with everybody having mobile access, you can actually strengthen the rights of secondary holders. You can use rights to transact rights and facilitate market emergence and transfer resources to beneficiaries directly, including resources from climate finance. And that, of course, depends on the regulatory environment, but it provides very significant positive aspects. I think I give some examples of rural use right documentation and transferability that show how this potential can actually be realized. I think Mexico, which documented rights to more than 100 million hectares in the early 2000s, is the example that many African countries have followed in their regulatory framework. It essentially relied on three aspects. First, communities were incorporated and had a clear status and accountability, the internal accountability. Second, rights to common housing and individual rights were adjudicated and registered. And there was overall and transfers, majority decisions were facilitated transfers to outsiders, and also the transition to the individual property rights regime. That has been documented to increase structural transformation, productivity, and migration. One example where that has been applied, or the similar effects have been realized is Benin, where Plan Foncier Rural had very positive effects in terms of reducing tree cover losses. And I think these pictures here are some of the different land use types that have been documented by referring to satellite imagery and then used for local recognition of rights. They have improved management and exclusion on common land. They increased women's following, but a need to actually acquire title, which I think has endangered many of these positive aspects, which shows that you do not really need to go to full title, but in many cases documentation of use rights is fully sufficient if these use rights can be exchanged. That is shown also in the case of Ethiopia, where in 2005 a very broad and effective program for documenting local land rights at less than $1 a parcel was implemented. That has been shown to have very positive impact on security, especially by women, and transferability of rights. And that has been followed by a second stage effort that actually mapped the land as well. And that studies show that eliminated 40% of the misallocation that was present in that context. Of course, urban, I think the potential and the importance of urban land and credit markets has been significantly underestimated in the past, because in many cases, if you want to establish a registry, starting in urban is much better than in rural areas, because land values and the scope for market transactions is much higher, the cost of service delivery lower, and that is very important, especially as Africa is undergoing the most rapid urbanization in the world right now, and ex post upgrading rather than incremental development and building the infrastructure that then can have building infrastructure first and then having people to upgrade incrementally is very much more expensive. I give two examples here. One is a nationwide program in Rwanda, where that also builds on the overhaul of the land law, including women's inheritance rights, and that facilitated the country to title all of its 11.5 parcels in the whole country at a cost of $6 per parcel. It also, the country Rwanda advanced from being number 135 in doing business to number 1 in less than 10 years. And as I already mentioned earlier, 86% of women had were owners individually or joint. That had a big impact on investment and also increments in tax revenue that allowed to recoup the program cost in about 8 years. In Lesotho, again, the importance of regulatory reform followed by urban titling is illustrated very clearly. Legal and institutional reform that reduced registration costs. It was followed by systematic titling that doubled the number of female co-owners. But what is interesting is that the impact on land and credit markets of the institutional reforms was much larger, because the institutional reforms essentially also benefited those who already had documented rights to their land, which were mostly the more regularized and the higher value areas. That's why I think that both of the elements need to go together and can actually go together in urban areas. Another area that has been underemphasized historically is the aspect of property taxation, because in urban areas, we all are aware that skill-based agglomeration benefits are the key for cities' wealth creation. But of course, these benefits can be outweighed by urban costs such as congestion, crime, and disease. And public investment needs to be counteract these urban costs to ensure urban productivity. And that, of course, means that property taxes can be very important. They are less distortive and regressive than capital and consumption taxes because land is not mobile, whereas capital and consumption are. The data for full tax maps, especially with satellite imagery, I think one 3D image generated from satellite imagery is illustrated here. Tax maps, creating tax maps is very easy. And having tax collection, of course, will also increase accountability and the demand for secure property rights. And recurrent property tax collection helps to ensure the currency of land records. All of these, I think, make it very important and very effective and imply that property taxation can well be efforts to improve property taxation can be a first step towards acquiring secure land rights. In doing such programs, I think a recent program that the bank did in Nigeria shows how that can be taken to scale there. I think the bank worked with all the states, 32 states, to document in a period of about 6 months some 8 million structures and associated land parcels, and then started to work on also updating and addressing the regulatory framework, both in terms of strengthening enforcement, in terms of reducing transfer taxes, and ensuring that assessed property values are actually public so that land markets can better function and the associated benefits can be, and also property taxes are more transparent. What does this mean to drawing all of these together means that there are really a number of aspects that need to be considered, and that we are now building on this report, actually putting together in a global index of land institutions that will allow us to better benchmark the status of different countries. These focus first on land record digitization and information access. Second, on land record interoperability. Third, on property taxation. And last but not least, on public land management. And I think many of the elements I have already mentioned, so I don't want to go into detail. But I think we have data for about 80 countries so far, and we hope that we can publish that very soon to actually provide a benchmark for African countries to see, and also to give goal, which I think is very important. I think the example of Rwanda, where policymakers always told us that, look, it is very important for us to see actually what is the end goal. And if we have that goal clear, then we can take the policy measures much more confidently. What does it mean in terms of moving forward? I think there are great opportunities, especially in 3 areas. The first one is to establish the regulatory and institutional framework for low-cost coverage with urban titles. That I think by enhancing the publicity and trust through full digital legacy records, bringing the cost in line with the willingness to pay, increasing the quality of the records. And I think that is a program that can be implemented at city level in many contexts and can significantly increase, given that in most African cities we have only 70% coverage. I think that can really spur demand, and then by linking that to property taxation, also increase local revenues and accountability. In rural areas, it is important to operationalize legislation for use right certification that is existing in many contexts already, by clarifying responsibilities and rights of local authorities with respect to planning incentives, providing them incentives, and also data maintenance. Local dispute resolution and accountability, which we have seen is very important in an advantage that local institutions have, because central institutions often are very distant from the reality and not accessible, and ways to document and enforce secondary rights and transfer and interact with outsiders as a group, and evolve over time. And of course, a third element is to clarify the arrangements for documenting, managing, and monitoring the use of public land, which is often underemphasized as people only look at private land. And especially in the context of marginal lands, which are often public, this is very, very important. This is why the bank has been working with a number of countries to establish inventories of public land, documenting the actual land use, and then allowing local governments to actually make the best use of that land, which has led to significant increases in productive and use the use and the benefits from this land that are available to locals once the responsibility is for management is clear. And that, of course, I think is something that also has a lot of potential going forward. Of course, there is no one size fits all. I think Africa is very diverse, and therefore it is very important to adapt to local conditions and to experiment to make sure that through trial and error, that whatever is being implemented actually fits to local conditions. That is where the bank and its partners can play a very important supporting role, and where also we see a lot of potential for working together with with the Japanese, not only with African institutions, of course, but also Japanese researchers who have made very important contributions to many of the topic areas that I have been described here, and where we hope that we can continue our collaboration in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for giving us a very detailed explanation about this interesting new report on land policies. Thank you very much. We received some questions from our viewers in advance. Also, some questions just came in during the presentation. Let me start with the question which we received from Sasaki-san. As usual, thank you very much for sending your question. His question is this one. How does the World Bank collaborate with the other development partners, such as African Development Bank and UN agencies, to support the government of Africa to promote land policy reform? Let me actually push the button a little bit further on this question. Not only as to our collaboration with African Development Bank and other agencies in terms of the operational side, but also, for the land policy related research, data gathering must be very much challenging task. You need to collaborate with other agencies. You may need to collaborate with the government. I just wanted to ask, in addition to the collaboration in terms of the operations, but also to prepare and conduct the research itself on this particular topic in Africa, in terms of the collaboration with the other agencies. This is the first question. Then second question that we received from question we received from Pedro's Intouch. Thank you very much for your question. Question is this: the difference between an old and the new city is planning. How well does the land industry work with a planning agency, planning division in Africa? So probably the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in terms of the land and planning issues. So this is a second question. So I would like to ask Klaus to come in to make a comment. We received some questions from other participants, so we'll go for another round asking your question. So Klaus, please come in. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Let me respond to the last question first. I think that is clearly, I think what the problem with planning in Africa is that many African cities have town and country plans or very rigid plans that were developed in colonial times, and that are still, even though that are neither suitable for African conditions where urbanization is rapidly increasing, and that also cannot be enforced, because in many, one example is that you actually need to have minimum lot sizes of 400 square meters or even larger. And I think also another regulatory gap is that many African countries do not have strata title acts, which means you can only build one house on a parcel, but you cannot build high rises and condominia, because defining rights to a condominium is very difficult or is not legally possible. And that is an area of reform where we have been working a lot with African governments and also with the African Development Bank, actually, and our partners in the UN, to make sure that the legal basis is in place, that such laws where they do not exist are actually, I think in Malawi, we are right now implementing a reform, I think, which just last week discussed about the draft of the law that allows a strata title. And that, I think, will be very important, because what we need is African cities to build high rather than just build flat. And then I think, because as a result of building only one-story buildings, of course, you need a lot of land. You need that creates problems in terms of being requiring very long commutes, creating a lot of pollution, and therefore neither being productive, economically productive, nor being environmentally friendly. And that's where also I think it's very important to be able to acquire land for the infrastructure construction and to build the arterial infrastructure that is needed for urban expansion as cities grow in Africa, and then allow through transit or through land value capture, where you then tax some of the value increases that come because you put in place the infrastructure, that actually you generate some of the financing for infrastructure construction. So what is needed, I think, is incentives for the private sector to come in or to facilitate the private sector to come in. And that is where I think a big agenda is there, and we are working very actively. So it's not really enforcing the existing plans, but changing the whole approach to planning in a way that allows public-private sector collaboration and partnerships, and where we can then actually have an environment where private sectors are not impeded by outdated regulation, but they actually facilitated by government policies to provide additional floor space and housing that is very much needed to accommodate the rapidly growing population of African cities. I think in that context, I have already mentioned some of the aspects where I think we are collaborating very closely with African Development Bank, but also UN Habitat, in providing examples. I think on the urban side, land pooling, which I think is also something that Japan has a long history and provides very many good examples, that have been applied in African countries, is another area where a policy that we have been actively promoting. And of course, I think we are working together with the UN in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, where there are a number of them that relate to secure tenure, and where I think we are working together closely. But of course, I think what is very important, especially since if we want to change policy, we need to have research that is based on the facts, and that is something, and that where Japanese researchers, I think Kei Otsuka has been an example and the guiding light for all of us at University of Tokyo. And I think there are very many scholars that have been trained and collaborated with him, who have been doing excellent and pathbreaking work in Africa. I think Ethiopia is one of the countries where a lot of the research that I have been mentioning in aggregate has actually been conducted by Japanese researchers. And we very much look forward to actually expanding this collaboration in the future.
Thank you very much for your responses, including very much encouraging comment on potential and further collaboration with the Japanese researchers. Thank you. Next, we received so many questions from Mode BOA, Orobola Akindadewo. I think you are now holding the record of the number of the questions that one can send to us at one point. Let me read three questions from a long list of the questions, which I will share with you later and I'll ask our speakers to respond separately. But let me read the questions. First one, what innovative land management practices are emerging in Africa? How can technology be leveraged to improve land administration and use? So this is the first question. Second one, what role do land policies play in ensuring food security? How do current land policies address environmental sustainability and resilience to climate change? So this is the second set of questions. Third one, what measures are in place to protect and rehabilitate degraded land? So these are the questions. In fact, again, he sent so many questions, but I purposely pick up those three questions. I would like to ask Klaus to come in to make the brief comment on his question. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. These are very broad questions, I think. So in terms of innovative practices and the use of technology, I think there are three areas that are very promising. The first one is, and then maybe let me start with urban property taxation, which is something which I've already touched on in the presentation. I think the use of satellite imagery to actually document urban structures comprehensively has completely transformed the space there, and of course allows to implement urban property taxation much more effectively, use that as a basis for documenting rights, and then also help these rights to mature. And of course, that also, I mean, if you look at that over time, then of course you can also document urban expansion, and there are a number of very promising initiatives, some of which the World Bank is also involved, to actually document globally the extent of built space, and document and monitor that in 6 monthly periods, so that also I think we can have something that allows us to assess the impact of policies relatively quickly. So that is very promising. The second one is farm registries in rural areas, which I think I have touched upon a little bit, but I think which have a lot of potential, and I think are being used in a number of cases. I think one area is the private sector, really, in terms of high value export crops. Farmer registries are used for responsible sourcing and supply chain certification, but also many countries have now, building on this experience, realized that expanding the use of farmer registries can help to document not only the source of where your produce comes from, and allows to then also to adhere to certain standards that are increasingly important in importing countries, but also to help farmers access markets for credit, and to link digitally to output suppliers and traders. And that is something where I think a lot of interesting research and innovation is going on. And the third aspect is digital mapping of public land and management of such public land using satellite imagery to land use documentation in near real time, which again is something where I think on the one hand you can link the imagery, but on the other hand, of course, you need to create the local institutions. And that is something where empowering local governments, and I think there's some very interesting research, for example, on where degraded public lands have been given to youth groups who took responsibility for that, which provided, and which has not only significantly improved the productivity of that land, but also helped youth who would otherwise not have a lot of opportunities to actually create a livelihood and even expand their horizon beyond the local level and engage in trade and other marketing activities. On the second question regarding food security, of course, what is important is on the one hand, has long been important for African farmers to produce their own food, and that has provided an important safety net. But of course, increasingly, especially as we see increasing fragmentation of farms and expansion into more marginal lands, that also needs to be complemented with potential for insurance, where again digital farm registries provide a very important opportunity, but also for diversification and markets and for investment and adaptation investment in that context is very important, and that I think is something we are actively working on. Sorry, I forgot now the third question.
Third question, what measures are in place to protect and rehabilitate the degraded land?
Of course, the degraded land. Of course, I mentioned some of the degraded land already, but so I think, there have been some very promising initiative of payment for environmental services, and they've shown that actually, if you do this in a competitive way and based on, you can generate significant resources and capture carbon at the price that can be competitive with international markets. And that is something, so I think that in terms of carbon finance, that is something that is very important for rehabilitating degraded land. And another aspect, which I think is increasingly, which is emerging, is the use of degraded lands for renewables, especially solar and wind energy, which I think is something that a lot of research has been done, but which I think is an area where future research will be very important, because Africa has a lot of potential in that context. And we want to make sure that the benefits of such investments go to local people rather than ending up in conflict and not benefiting local people.
Thank you for your responses. We received a question and comment from Professor Naoyuki Yoshino of Keio University, he is a professor emeritus at Keio University. So let me read his question and comment. Thank you very much for your excellent summary. Question: inheritance tax is working well in Japan, charging very high taxes from parents for succeeding in the land. This equalizes the income disparities. How about in African countries? So this was his question and the comment. The land trust has been extensively used to well utilize the land to build high-rise apartment and buildings in Japan. Landowners keep the land, but they sell the utilization right of the land to apartment developers. It also requires good land registration to use the land trust. So this was his comment. So I'd like to invite Klaus to come in to make some response comment on those points. And then perhaps we have 5 minutes left. So together with the responses, I would like to ask Klaus to give us a very final message, his final remarks to the audience in Japan, and then we wrap up. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you very much. I think, or on the land trust, I couldn't agree more. And that is, I think, what I referred to earlier as land sharing. It is very important, and it's one of the many innovations that Japan has, and that can be very useful for African countries, because in the end, you need to build high rises, and you need to accommodate a growing urban population. And having models that go out of what traditionally has been applied, or I think a little bit outside the box and make sure that public and private sector can come together is very important. And I think in that context also, I think on the land tax, I think talking about an inheritance tax, of course, is something that will have an impact in the longer term, and I think is very important for intergenerational equity and redistribution. I think that is something where certainly there could be a lot of potential, but of course, before you can even talk about an inheritance tax, you need to have the rights documented first. And you also can talk about recurrent land taxes. And one of the key problems in African countries, as I've shown in the presentation, is that registration fees are very high. So that's why we are pushing, and where I think the example of the inheritance tax is very important. Taxing land is much better than charging fees for registration, because registration fees discourage formality, push people into informality. They create they also are a hotbed for corruption, which we do not want. But I think taxing land on a recurrent basis, and then of course also taxing the transfer from one generation to the other in the context of inheritance, is something that is not distortive and that provides an unutilized potential for capturing land values in African context, and is certainly something which I think is a very good suggestion. So I think, no, thank you very much. I think we really are excited about the potential that technology provides to actually go beyond, open some new pages on the discussion of land in Africa, that also include urban land, that look at some of the institutional innovations that can come into place if you have secure land records, and to implement these with digital technology very quickly. So we think this is a very exciting area, and we very much look forward to collaborating with Japanese researchers and also agencies globally to help us design, adjust these instruments to local conditions, and then really scale them up quickly, because things are moving very quickly in Africa, and we need to really be able to advise governments fast. So we look forward to, and we see this as a really exciting agenda for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had the Klaus Denning, who is a lead economist in the World Bank's Development Economics Vice Presidency, presented the land policy for resilient and equitable growth in Africa, one of the latest report on the Africa issued on the April 2024 this year. Klaus, thank you very much for your time and present, and also responded to all the questions that we received. Very appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So we are going to continue organizing interesting seminars. Let me make some announcement. First, on the August 7th, Wednesday at 12 p.m. In Japan Standard Time, we are going to have Dan Logar, who is the program manager for the governance program at the Development Impact Evaluation (DIME) program in the World Bank's Development Economics Vice Presidency, who happened to be in Tokyo for his own vacation, but we grabbed him and asked him to make some of his stay for the public purposes. And then we are going to organize a seminar focusing on the work by the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation team, particularly focusing on the governance. This is once again August 7th, Wednesday. And also, related to Africa, we are going to have an honor of hosting our Chief Economist for Africa region, Andrew Dabalen, who is going to be coming to Tokyo to represent the World Bank at the TICAT ministerial meeting, which is going to be held at the end of August. And we are going to organize a seminar featuring him as a keynote speaker together with Institute of Development Economies, Asia Keizai Kenkyūjō, which we are going to announce shortly, probably early next week. But this is going to be held on the Friday, 4:30 Friday, August 23rd, 4:30 p.m. To 6 p.m. at the World Bank Tokyo office. Those both seminars that I just mentioned will be held in a hybrid manner. So if you have opportunity to join these seminars in person, please come. If not, please also join virtually to take advantage of these interesting discussion at the seminar. So with that, thank you very much for joining. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next time for the another occasion. Thank you very much.